Welcome back to The Shadows. Before we uncover tonight's archived file, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you never get lost in the dark. The tape hissed. Cold breath hit the mic. Nothing moved outside, yet the floorboards beneath the cabin groaned under a weight that had no shape. Through the salt-crusted glass of the window, Sam stared out into the freezing Appalachian gloom. The recording was playing back his own voice from 3 hours ago, but the words coming out of the speaker were not things he had ever said. They were instructions on how to strip the meat from his own ribs. 3 days earlier, the winter had descended upon the ridge with the sudden, indifferent violence of an iron vault door slamming shut. Sam Miller was 58 years old, a retired surveyor whose lungs carried the chalky dust of 40 summers spent measuring property lines for coal companies that no longer existed. He had rented the cabin at Hollow Creek to escape the humid din of the lowland towns, bringing only 2 crates of tinned rations, a kerosene stove, and a battery-powered shortwave receiver that mostly picked up static from the ridge towers. The cabin itself sat in a shallow depression between 2 barren ridges of spruce and hemlock, 5 miles past the end of the county service road. It was an old structure, built from hand-hewn white oak logs that had turned the color of wet slate over 60 years of hard freezes. The air inside smelled faintly of creosote and cured tobacco, a dense, dry odor that seemed to absorb sound rather than let it echo. Before I unpack the rest of this file for you tonight, I should mention something about the manuscript Sam left behind. Looking through these pages, I found myself checking the lock on my own front door twice. Not because of what he saw, but because of how quietly it all began. On his second afternoon, while prying up a warped floorboard near the wood stove to level the legs, Sam found the ledger. It was a cloth-bound ledger from a long-defunct logging outfit, wrapped in oilskin that had gone brittle with age. Inside, written in the flat, pragmatic cursive of a timber manager from the 1950s, were daily tallies of oak cordage alongside entries that made no practical sense. One page noted that 3 draft mules had refused to cross the dry creek bed because the shadows of the trees were falling against the direction of the afternoon sun. Another entry, dated November 12, 1954, recorded that the camp cook had spent 48 hours listening to liquid boiling furiously inside a cold iron kettle that had been sitting unfilled on a dead hearth. Sam set the book on the pine table beside his lantern, chuckling with the thin, raspy dry cough of a lifelong smoker. He was a man trained to trust the transit level and the steel tape. Anomalies in old woods were merely the result of bad whiskey, mountain fever, or the damp rot that twisted the minds of men left too long alone in the hollows. Yet that evening, as the dusk settled into a bruised violet haze over the hemlocks, the first physical contradiction presented itself. The temperature had plunged to 4 degrees below zero. The frost on the cabin's northern window was thick enough to carve with a pocket knife, forming jagged, crystalline ferns across the glass. But when Sam reached for the brass handle of the iron stove to damp the draft, he realized the air surrounding the chimney pipe was completely devoid of heat, while the tin mug of water sitting 6 inches from the glowing coals had frozen solid into a block of milky ice. He held his bare palm an inch above the iron stove top. The metal was white-hot, radiating a dull orange light through the seam of the door, yet his skin felt only the dry, biting chill of an unheated cellar. The heat was not dissipating into the room. It was disappearing into the iron itself, locked inside a thermal dead zone that defied every physical law he had spent 30 years relying upon. He reached for his notebook to record the temperature, his fingers stiffened by the unexplained cold. Outside, the wind had died completely, leaving the forest in a silence so heavy it felt engineered. There were no snaps of frozen branches, no rustle of dry oak leaves under the weight of the snow. Then, from the dark perimeter beyond the porch rail, came the sound of a heavy axe striking a wet log. It was a single wet thud, followed 4 seconds later by the distinct, rhythmic creak of a hand winch pulling wire rope taut through a rusted pulley, a sound that had not been heard in these woods since the timber camps closed 70 years ago. The sound did not repeat, but its rhythm remained trapped in Sam's ears like the phantom ticking of a pocket watch dropped down a dry well. He stood behind the thick timber door for 20 minutes, his hand resting on the iron bolt, listening to the vast, empty air outside. The cold within the cabin had settled into a flat, motionless weight that made his breath hang in dense, gray plumes that refused to drift or settle to the floor. He opened the logging ledger again under the yellow glow of his mantel lamp. The ink on the yellowed pages seemed slightly darker than it had been 2 hours ago, as though the paper were slowly absorbing moisture from the air. He turned to the entries from December 1954. The handwriting had degraded from the precise copperplate script of the early pages into a jagged, hurried scrawl. It doesn't make noise to announce itself. The entry read, "The pencil lead cutting deep enough to tear the fiber. It uses the noises you left behind last week. If you hear yourself calling the dogs, don't open the latch. You're already inside the room listening to it." Sam set his jaw, the hard instinct of a former county surveyor kicking in against the creeping tide of absurdity. He took his heavy wool coat from the peg, slid his flashlight into his deep pocket, and stepped out onto the porch. The snow around the cabin was untouched, a smooth, unblemished sheet of white that caught the pale blue moonlight filter through the clouds. There were no boot prints leading toward the hemlock stand where the axe stroke had sounded. The air was so dry it burned his nostrils, yet when he exhaled, his lungs produced no vapor at all outside the door, as if the physical process of his breathing were being suppressed the moment he stepped off the wooden porch. He walked 20 paces toward the dry creek bed, his boots making a crisp, dry crunch in the crust. He stopped by a massive, lightning-scarred white oak that marked the property boundary. He lifted the flashlight, sweeping its pale beam across the gray trunks. The beam did not travel through the trees. 10 feet from the glass lens, the light simply ceased, not dissolved by fog or blocked by foliage, but abruptly cut off in midair along a perfectly straight vertical line, as if striking an invisible sheet of black velvet stretched between the pines. Beyond that boundary, the forest was not merely dark, it was absent. Now, as a narrator who has spent hundreds of hours reading through reports of missing persons in isolated counties, I can tell you there is a specific tone people use when they realize their surroundings are no longer cooperating with reality. It's not panic. It's a quiet, cold detachment. Sam swung the light left and right. The edge of the illumination remained clipped, forming a rigid semicircle around him with a radius of precisely 12 feet. He stepped backward toward the cabin, and the boundary moved with him, maintaining the exact same distance from his body like a shadow tied to his boots. From the dark beyond the light boundary, a sound emerged. It was the dry, rasping cough of a smoker, the exact 3-stroke cough Sam had released 2 hours earlier while sitting by the stove. It wasn't an echo. The timing, the pitch, the slight whistle in the second breath. It was an absolute mechanical duplication of his own respiratory distress, delivered from a point 6 inches above the ground in the dark brush. Sam did not run. His 30 years in the field had taught him that running in dark timber was how men broke their ankles and died of exposure. Instead, he retreated step by step, keeping his flashlight pointed at the edge of the light barrier. As his heel hit the bottom step of the porch, the voice spoke again from the dark edge of the trees. It did not use words. It repeated the sound of his own heavy wool coat rubbing against the pine doorframe from 20 minutes ago. A low, rhythmic zip, zip, zip of canvas against dry wood. He ducked inside, through the iron latch, and bolted the oak door. He sat at the table, his chest heaving, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He reached for his pocket tape recorder, a small, silver device he used for recording field notes, and pressed the record button to document what he was experiencing. "Temperature inside cabin dropping," Sam said into the microphone, his voice trembling slightly. "Visual field restricted at 12 feet. Audible mimicking of personal acoustics." He pressed stop, then rewind, and hit play to verify the track. The speaker clicked. His voice came out clearly, but the words were different. "Temperature inside cabin dropping." The tape played back in his exact voice. "The perimeter has closed to 8 feet. Do not look under the pine table." Sam froze. His eyes slowly drifted down toward the shadows beneath the table where the ledger lay open on the floor. The wooden legs of the pine table offered no sanctuary, only a pool of absolute pitch where the yellow light from the lantern seemed to curve away rather than enter. Sam's breath came in ragged, shallow gasps, each exhale releasing a dry hiss that hung in the frozen air of the cabin. Slowly, with the deliberate, agonizing care of a man placing his foot upon a landmine, he knelt down on the drafty floorboards and swept his heavy flashlight beneath the table frame. There was no physical creature waiting in the recess, no twisted shape lurking in the dark timber. Instead, the floorboards beneath the table were simply gone, replaced by a circular patch of raw, black earth roughly 3 feet across. The soil was covered in a dense layer of white hoarfrost that sparkle did not glisten under the torchlight, but seemed to swallow the light entirely, leaving behind a dull, velvety gray. From the center of this patch of frozen earth grew a single, gnarled root of a white oak tree, a root no thicker than a man's wrist, severed cleanly at both ends as if cut by a copper axe. Yet despite being detached from any living trunk, the bark of the root was pulsating with a slow, rhythmic contraction, expanding and flattening every 6 seconds like the carotid artery of a sleeping hound. Before we proceed further into Sam's notes from that night, I think it's worth reflecting on how easily we trust the stability of the ground beneath our feet. We build our homes on the assumption that soil remains soil, that wood remains dead, and that the foundation under our bed isn't keeping time with something breathing far below the frost line. Sam pulled his hand back, his knuckles scraping against the edge of the floorboards. The wood was no longer dry oak. It had taken on the texture of cold, waterlogged leather, soft enough to yield under the pressure of his thumb without splintering. He reached for his pocket knife to test the density of the grain, but as his steel blade touched the timber, the knife produced no metallic click. The sound was swallowed instantly, replaced by the faint, muffled thud of a wet stone dropping into thick mud. He stood up quickly, his hips catching the corner of the heavy table. The lantern flared, its mantle flickering with a sickly blue flame that cast elongated, distorted shadows across the log walls. The room had shrunk. He was certain of it now. The distance between the wood stove and the eastern wall, which he had measured at 14 feet on his first morning, now appeared barely wide enough for him to extend both arms without touching the cedar beams. He returned to the logging ledger, his hands shaking so violently he nearly tore the oilskin wrapping. The cursive script on the next page had shifted again, the ink bleeding outward into the cotton paper like ink dropped in still water. The entry was dated December 14th, 1954, the final date recorded before the timber company abandoned the hollow completely. The timber line doesn't recede when you cut it, the entry read, written in a hand that was barely legible. It folds inward. The surveyor thought he was running a straight line from the ridge to the creek, but his chain kept coming up 4 rods short every time he passed the dead oak. He spent 3 days measuring the same 100 yards until his ears started bleeding from the silence. If the walls begin to feel close, do not check the door. The door only leads back to the table. Sam dropped the book onto the table. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the northern corner of the cabin, like the sound of an iron cable snapping under tension. He whipped his flashlight toward the source of the noise. The heavy glass window frame had not shattered. The glass had simply lost its transparency, turning into a solid, opaque sheet of gray slate that mirrored the rough texture of the outdoor rock faces. The frost on the outside was no longer on the exterior. It was creeping across the inside surface of the stone slate, forming intricate, branching patterns that spelled out the precise geographic coordinates of the cabin in degrees, minutes, and seconds. Then, from directly above his head, came the slow, heavy drag of iron-shod boots walking across the cedar roof shingles, stepping slowly from the ridgepole down toward the eaves, directly over the spot where he stood. The weight on the roof was not the scattered pitter-patter of snow falling from branches, nor was it the light scamper of a mountain bobcat. It was the heavy, deliberate tread of a man wearing caulked logging boots, steel spikes biting deeply into dry cedar shakes with every step. Crunch, slide, crunch. The ceiling beams above Sam's head groaned under the load, dropping thin lines of ancient pine dust down into his hair. Sam stood paralyzed in the center of the narrowing room, his right hand gripping the cold iron barrel of his double-barreled shotgun, which he had pulled from the canvas bag beside his cot. The steel was so cold his skin threatened to stick to the receiver, yet his palm was slick with a thin, icy sweat. "Who's up there?" he called out, his voice sounding flat and muffled, as though he were shouting inside a lined wool coffin. The footsteps stopped directly above the stovepipe. A long, drawn-out silence followed, thick enough to strain his eardrums. Then came the response, not from the roof, but from the iron belly of the stove itself. It was the sound of a brass pocket watch being wound with a tiny key. Click, click, click. The metallic ratcheting was perfectly clear, echoing inside the cold firebox where the coals had long since died into gray ash. Sam stepped back, his boot heel catching on the edge of the open floorboard near the table. He stumbled, lowering his flashlight beam for a fraction of a second. The room had altered its proportions again. The doorway leading to the small lean-to kitchen, where he had stored his canned beans and dry firewood, was no longer rectangular. The heavy timber frame had warped into a tight, narrow parallelogram, leaning hard to the left at an angle that made his head swim with a sudden, violent motion sickness. The space inside the kitchen looked no deeper than an arm's length. The far wall brought so close he could see the individual saw marks on the rough pine boards. He rushed to the main cabin door, threw back the iron bolt, and shoved the heavy oak panel open, desperate for the vast, freezing expanse of the open forest. The door opened, but it did not reveal the snow-covered porch or the pale moonlight filtering through the hemlocks. Instead, the doorway opened directly onto another identical cabin room. Sam froze on the threshold, his boot suspended over the sill. In front of him sat an identical pine table, an identical mantel lamp burning with the same sickly blue flame, and an identical man standing with his back turned, holding a double-barreled shotgun aimed at an iron stove in the corner. The man in the room ahead turned his head slowly. The side of his face came into the blue light. It was Sam, his own graying temple, his own weathered jawline, his own notched left earlobe from a surveyor's wire accident 30 years ago. But the eyes in that reflection were completely devoid of irises, filled instead with two solid spheres of polished gray slate that reflected no light at all. I've looked at enough archival photos of isolated homesteads to know that isolation does strange things to a man's perception of space. But what Sam was documenting in his small silver tape recorder wasn't a trick of the mind. It was a physical collapse, the forest pinching itself shut like a leather pouch being pulled tight by a drawstring. The duplicate Sam in the forward room raised his left hand and pointed a stiff, frozen finger back toward the floor beneath the table. Before Sam could retreat or pull the trigger of his shotgun, the doorway behind him slammed shut with a concussive boom that rattled his teeth. The air in the room suddenly grew so dense it felt like swimming in cold lard. The smell of creosote gave way to a suffocating metallic odor, the sharp copper tang of crushed zinc and wet slate. From the silver tape recorder sitting on the table, The small red light flickered to life on its own. The tiny internal speaker began to play, producing not his voice, but the sound of two heavy stones grinding together in a slow, continuous circle deep beneath the floorboards. Between the grinding noises, a voice spoke through the static. It was the voice of the timber manager who had written the logging ledger 70 years ago, speaking with a dry, matter-of-fact mountain drawl. Entry 402. We have cleared the trees, but the valley refuses to stay open. The surveyor is still walking the perimeter. He thinks he is trying to get out, but he is only tightening the line. Sam dropped his shotgun. The heavy iron barrel struck the floorboards with a dull, wooden thud that carried no echo, and the lantern on the table flickered out completely, plunging the cabin into a silence so absolute he could hear the sound of his own blood freezing inside his veins. The silence inside the cabin was no longer an absence of sound. It was a physical weight that pressed against Sam's eardrums until his inner ears throbbed with a rhythmic, wet pulse. He remained motionless on the cold oak floorboards, his cheek pressed against the rough grain, watching the gray slate window pane where the frost had frozen into geographic coordinates. The mantel lamp lay extinguished on the table above him, its glass chimney cracking with a tiny, brittle snap as the iron casing contracted in the plunging cold. In the dark, his senses adjusted to the altered dimensions of the cabin. The floor beneath him was no longer flat. The rough-hewn oak planks were sloping downward at a steady, 9-degree incline toward the northern corner of the room, as though the foundation piers had sunk deep into softened clay. When he reached out his hand to steady himself, his fingers slid across a thin layer of cold, damp silt that smelled faintly of crushed riverbed and wet iron ore. As someone who spends his late nights sifting through county survey maps and abandoned property deeds, I can tell you that timber structures don't tilt like this on solid bedrock. Bedrock doesn't yield unless something massive and hollow is opening up directly beneath the joists, a void that has been waiting under the mountain roots for decades. Sam pulled himself up onto his knees, his muscles stiffened by the frost that was beginning to rim the collar of his wool coat. He did not reach for the shotgun lying on the floorboards. His fingers instead found the heavy brass casing of his secondary torch in his pocket. He clicked the switch. The beam did not throw a broad cone of light across the room. The light squeezed out of the lens in a narrow, dense shaft, no thicker than a pencil, piercing the black air until it struck the far log wall. The wall was no longer made of white oak logs. The timber had turned into thick, vertical slabs of unpolished slate, damp with condensation that dripped down the stone face with the slow, viscous rhythm of cold oil. He turned the narrow beam toward the corner where the stove stood. The iron stove had completely vanished. In its place was a vertical shaft in the stone floor, roughly 3 feet in diameter, lined with the same severed, pulsating white oak roots he had seen beneath the table. The mouth of the shaft emitted a steady, faint draft of warm, stagnant air that tasted of iron, old paper, and stale tobacco smoke. From deep within the stone shaft, perhaps 40 feet down in the subterranean dark, came the sound of a heavy brass typewriter carriage returning. Clack, 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 ding. The sound was followed immediately by the dry, rhythmic cough of the timber manager whose entries filled the logging ledger. It was not a voice calling out for help. It was the mechanical repetition of a man clearing his lungs before reading aloud from an official document. Sam moved toward the lip of the shaft, drawn not by curiosity, but by the terrifying realization that the walls of the upper cabin were continuing to contract. The slate panels were leaning inward, the space between the floor and the roof timbers narrowing to less than 5 feet. The ceiling beams were bowing downward with a dull, groan-like creak, dropping heavy splinters of ancient cedar into the silt around his boots. He looked down into the shaft. The narrow beam of his torch revealed a series of iron rungs driven directly into the damp stone wall. railroad spikes from the old timber line, coated in a thick layer of red rust that flared bright orange under the light. He gripped the first iron rung. The metal was not cold. It was burning hot, radiating a dry, desert heat that instantly melted the frost clinging to his leather gloves. He lowered his feet into the dark, stepping down off the sinking floorboards of the cabin just as the roof beams above collapsed inward with a final, airless thud, sealing the mouth of the shaft in complete and absolute darkness. The heat inside the stone shaft grew denser with every rung Sam descended, shifting from the biting frost of the mountain ridge to the oppressive, humid air of a deep coal mine. The smell of creosote had been completely replaced by the stench of wet paper, old binding glue, and the sharp ozone tang of static electricity. He climbed down 32 rungs before his boots struck solid floor. The ground beneath him was not raw earth or rock. It was a level, polished surface of dark slate, worn smooth by the passage of countless boots over a century of logging operations. Sam held his torch high, the thin beam slicing through the suspension of microscopic paper dust that filled the underground air. He was standing in a long, narrow gallery cut directly through the living rock of the ridge. The gallery was 6 feet wide and 7 feet high, its walls lined from floor to ceiling with wooden shelving units constructed from rough-hewn pine boards. Thousands of cloth-bound ledgers, identical to the one he had found beneath the cabin floorboards, were stacked systematically along the shelves. Every spine was marked with a date written in white chalk, ranging from the late 1800s to the present year. I've looked at photos of state archives and underground vaults, but what Sam was standing in wasn't built by any county government. There were no index cards, no steel filing cabinets, no electric conduits running along the ceiling beams. The vault was a geological formation that had grown around the records, the stone shelf units merging seamlessly with the slate walls. Sam walked down the center aisle, his boots leaving clear, dark prints in the light layer of paper dust coating the floor. As he passed the shelves, he realized that the ledgers were not silent. From inside the closed covers of the books came a faint, collective murmur, a low, insect-like rustle of turning pages accompanied by hundreds of overlapping voices whispering at the threshold of hearing. He caught fragments of sentences spoken in different accents and dialects, all of them recording mundane daily measurements. 40 cords of red oak, 7 chains to the creek bed. The sun set 20 minutes early over the western ridge. The water in the bucket has no reflection tonight. He stopped in front of a shelf marked with the current year. One ledger lay open on a small wooden reading desk at the end of the aisle, illuminated by a single brass oil lamp that burned with a steady yellow flame. The ink on the open page was still wet. Sam leaned over the desk, his flashlight beam overlapping with the oil lamp's glow. The entry was written in his own hand, his sharp, angular surveyor's script that he had used for 30 years to fill out boundary reports for the coal company. December 16th, the entry read, "The surveyor reached the 32nd rung at 9:20 p.m. He believes he is looking at an archive of timber records. He has not yet noticed that his own shadow on the wall behind him is holding a pencil." Sam froze. The air in his lungs turned to ice. Slowly, without making a sound, he turned his head to look at the damp slate wall behind the desk. The yellow light of the oil lamp cast his dark silhouette against the stone. But the shadow was not mimicking his posture. While Sam stood with both hands resting on the edge of the wooden desk, the shadow on the wall was bent forward over an invisible ledger, its dark, arm-like outline moving in precise, rhythmic strokes as if writing down every beat of his heart. From the dark corridor ahead, beyond the reach of the lamp, came the sound of a heavy brass bell striking once. Clang. The sound was followed by a voice that did not come through the air, but vibrated directly through the stone floor beneath his boots. A low, rasping voice that sounded like iron wheels turning over crushed gravel. "The record is incomplete. Bring the chain." The bell's strike died away, not into air, but into the iron-heavy marrow of Sam's own bones. The vibrations traveled upward through his boots, locking his knees with a sudden, rigid cramp that forced him to grip the edge of the reading desk. Beneath his palms, the smooth pine board had grown wet, oozing a dark, brackish brine that smelled of deep river silt and long-decayed hemlock bark. The shadow cast against the slate wall by the brass oil lamp did not dissolve when Sam jerked his eyes away from it. Instead, the dark outline on the damp stone lifted its left arm, drawn with the absolute, needle-sharp precision of an ink draft, and mimicked the act of turning a heavy iron key in an unseen lock. Across the room, 30 feet down the subterranean gallery, a low, wet mechanical click resonated through the stacks of yellowed ledgers. Sam retreated 3 paces, his flashlight beam trembling as he swept it along the floor. The paper dust that had covered the slate pavement was shifting, gathering into thin, spiraling ridges that drifted across the stone like sand dunes under a desert wind. The dust moved toward the far end of the vault, drawn by a steady, low-pressure suction that hummed through the gaps between the shelving units. I've spent years looking through municipal engineering blueprints for old mountain towns, and there's a distinct difference between an excavation meant for mining and a structure designed for containment. Mines have shoring timbers, drainage troughs, and ventilation shafts. This place had none of those. The gallery was carved with the smooth, curved geometry of a throat. A passage is built to draw things downward, never to let them ascend. Sam forced his boots forward, the leather soles squeaking against the wet slate. He passed row after row of cloth-bound volumes, their spines marked with years that stretched back before the founding of the county. 1882, 1845, 1791. The handwriting on the faded spine labels transitioned from early industrial cursive to crabbed, Latinate script, then finally to primitive tally marks scratched directly into the tanned hide bindings with the point of a nail. At the terminus of the aisle, the gallery opened into a circular chamber carved from the mountain's granite core. The ceiling rose into a high, dome-like vault that lost itself in absolute pitch, far beyond the reach of his flashlight's narrow beam. In the precise center of the chamber sat a massive surveying transit, an old, heavy instrument fashioned from unpolished black iron and dull brass, for times the size of any tool Sam had operated during his 30 years in the coal fields. The transit's tripod legs were not set upon the rock. They were driven deep into the chest cavity of a petrified human corpse, half buried in a mound of dried pine needles and crushed slate. The body was dressed in the rotting remnants of an 18th century surveyor's coat, its mummified fingers locked around the brass leveling screws of the instrument with a grip that had turned to stone. Sam stepped up to the brass ocular lens. The glass was coated in a thin film of oil, but as he leaned close, he felt a strange, cold pull against his eyelid, a vacuum draw that seemed to drag his vision directly into the optical tube. He pressed his eye to the lens. He did not see the interior of the cavern or the dark timber of the mountain. Through the transit's crosshairs, he looked out onto the brightly lit kitchen of the cabin as it had been 3 days ago, on the afternoon he arrived. He saw himself sitting at the pine table, pouring hot coffee from an enamel pot, entirely unaware that 6 inches beneath his floorboards, a set of iron crosshairs was tracking every breath he drew. And sitting directly across the table from his past self, occupying the empty wooden chair he had brought for his supply crates, was the mummified figure from the cavern floor, its stone fingers holding a long steel pencil over an open, blank ledger. Sam pulled his head back from the brass eyepiece with a sharp, involuntary gasp, his lungs seizing on the dense, mineral-heavy air of the chamber. The illusion inside the transit had not flickered or dissolved. The image remained fixed within the lens, a living window looking backward through 3 days of solid time. He reached out a trembling hand and touched the cold iron casing of the transit tube. The metal was vibrating with a high-frequency whine, a pitch so high it bypassed his ears entirely, settling as an ache deep behind his cheekbones. With every vibration, the petrified corpse beneath the tripod shifted slightly, its dried, papery lips pulling back from its yellow teeth in what appeared to be a slow, mechanical grin. The secondary character in these mountain records, the man whose hand had filled the earliest pages of the logging book, had not been a victim of exposure or a cave-in. Looking at the iron chain wrapped 4 times around the corpse's waist and bolted directly into the granite floor, Sam realized the truth that every surveyor in these hollows eventually learned. The land didn't employ men to measure its boundaries. It bound them to the line until their bones became part of the mark. A sound echoed from the dark gallery behind him, the crisp, rhythmic crunch, crunch, crunch of heavy logging boots stepping over the paper dust. Someone was walking down the aisle of ledgers toward the circular chamber, their pace steady, unhurried, and absolute. Sam turned, sweeping his torch beam across the archway. The light caught a figure standing 30 feet away, framed between 2 rows of 100-year-old ledgers. It was a man wearing a thick canvas cruising vest and a wide-brimmed felt hat, his face obscured by the deep shadow cast by the brim. In his right hand, he carried an iron gunter's chain, a 66-foot measuring chain composed of 100 heavy iron links, dragged along the slate floor with a dry, harsh clink, clink, clink that sounded like teeth scraping across glass. "The line is out of square, Sam," the man said. The voice was not hostile. It carried the weary, flat cadence of an old county official who had worked 40 consecutive hours without sleep. It was the exact voice of the retired surveyor who had hired Sam 30 years ago to take over the coal company accounts. "You left the northern corner unpinned," the figure continued, taking 3 steps forward into the light. "The timber company paid for 60,000 acres, but the mountain expanded 4 rods to the east during the cold freeze of '54. Somebody has to hold the end of the chain while the survey settles." Sam raised his shotgun, his thumb slipping on the cold brass hammer as he pulled it back until it clicked into full cock. "Stay back," he rasped, his throat so dry the words tore at his vocal cords. "The lease on this parcel expired 70 years ago." The man in the felt hat did not stop. As he stepped fully into the flashlight's beam, the yellow light revealed his face. There were no features beneath the brim, where his eyes, nose, and mouth should have been. The skin was a smooth, unbroken plane of gray slate, marked only by 3 neat lines of red chalk drawn in the shape of an inverted surveyor's benchmark. The figure lifted the iron chain, offering the cold, rusted handle towards Sam's chest. "It doesn't expire, Sam." The voice spoke from the featureless slate face, the sound coming from the stone walls rather than the throat. "You don't measure the hollow. The hollow uses you to stay where it is." Sam pulled the trigger. The blast of the double-barreled shotgun did not split the subterranean air with a deafening roar. Instead, the white-hot flash of gunpowder produced only a flat, wooden thud, the sound of an empty crate striking dry loam. The lead shot ripped through the center of the figure's canvas vest, but there was no splatter of blood, no tearing of flesh. The heavy pellets passed clean through the torso as though it were constructed of dense mountain mist, striking the slate shelving behind with a series of tiny, metallic clicks. The figure in the felt hat did not flinch. He did not even break his steady, mechanical stride. He reached out with his left hand, his gray slate fingers clamping around the steel barrels of Sam's shotgun with a slow, crushing pressure. The cold radiated from the stone fingers directly through the gun's blued iron, crystallizing the oil in the action until the firing mechanism froze solid into a block of dull white frost. "The survey was signed in November of '54, Sam." The voice echoed from the slate walls, low and indifferent as a landslide in an unpopulated valley. "You can't shoot a boundary line. You can only record where it sits." Sam let go of the stock. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the wet slate floorboards that had begun to buckle upward like ice on a thawing pond. The circular chamber was shifting its physical geography. The high granite dome above had vanished, replaced by an endless vertical chimney lined with thousands of yellowed ledgers, their pages turning in unison with a sound like dry autumn leaves scraping across an asphalt road. I've spent months cross-referencing regional land disputes from the mid-20th century, and there is a recurring detail that rarely makes the official court records. Before a boundary line disappears from the county maps, the surveyors assigned to mark it always report the same sensory anomaly. They stop hearing the sound of their own heartbeat, replaced by the rhythmic clinking of iron chains deep beneath the soil. Sam's flashlight beam flickered violently, its yellow light dimming to a faint, sickly orange wire. In the dying glow, he watched the figure lift the 66-foot Gunter's chain. The iron links were not rusted. They were coated in fresh, black soot that smelled of cold coal hearths and wet hemlock roots. The figure draped the heavy iron loop over Sam's shoulder. The weight was immediate and staggering. Not the weight of 40 pounds of forged iron, but the crushing, immovable mass of the entire mountain ridge pressing down upon his collarbone. Sam collapsed to his knees, the cold slate floor biting through his trousers as his hands pressed into the wet silt. Every 30 years, the line drifts 4 rods to the east. The featureless face spoke from above, its red chalk benchmark glowing faintly in the dimming light. The company thought they owned the timber. They only leased the space between the marks. Now you hold the end of the chain until the next surveyor comes down the shaft. From the open ledger resting on the wooden reading desk, a fountain pen lifted itself into the air, its steel nib hovering 2 inches above the wet paper, waiting for the final tally to be entered in his own handwriting. The weight of the iron chain over Sam's shoulder did not just press his body into the cold silt. It seemed to sink into his very muscles, binding his nervous system to the dark granite floor of the vault. Every breath he drew required a conscious, agonizing effort, his lungs pulling in air that tasted exclusively of ancient paper dust and cold copper ore. He looked down at his right hand resting on the wet slate desk. His skin had lost its ruddy, wind-burned tone, turning a pale, chalky gray that matched the texture of the stone walls. His fingers were stiffened by a deep, immovable chill, yet they were moving against his will. His index finger and thumb clamping around the stem of the floating fountain pen with the mechanical precision of a clockwork automaton. "Write the entry, Sam." The voice rasped from the darkness surrounding the desk. It was no longer just the voice of his old supervisor. It was a chorus of hundreds of voices, overlapping in a flat, expressionless drone. The voices of every logger, chain-bearer, and county surveyor who had entered the Hollow Creek parcel since the first white oak was cut in 1845. The company needs the tally before the morning freeze. Sam tried to force his throat to open, to scream into the vast, paper-lined void above him. But his vocal cords produced only the dry, 3-stroke cough he had recorded on his pocket tape 3 hours ago. The sound was picked up instantly by the surrounding ledgers, their yellowed pages rustling in response like a field of dry corn in a winter gale. Before I read you the final entry from Sam's notebook, I want you to consider something about the nature of these archives. They aren't records of what happened in the past. They are the blueprints for what the land demands from anyone who steps within its marked borders. The steel nib of the pen touched the wet paper of the open ledger. Without Sam's conscious control, his hand began to write in his sharp, angular script. December 16th. The northern pin is set in stone. The surveyor has accepted the chain. The cabin above is closed until the next lease is signed. As the final period was inked onto the page, the heavy iron chain around his shoulder suddenly lost its physical weight, transforming into a cold, dark band of shadow that merged directly into his skin, circling his torso like a dark tattoo. Across the chamber, the slate wall split open with a long, grinding roar. A shaft of pale, blue moonlight pierced the underground dark, revealing a narrow flight of rough stone steps leading upward through a fissure in the rock face. A path that led out onto the snow-covered ridge half a mile above the creek bed. The figure in the felt hat stepped back into the shadows of the ledger stacks, its red chalk mark fading into the dark stone. "You can leave the vault now, Sam," the voice echoed from the deep shelves, fading into a distant whisper. "But the line stays attached to your boots." Sam pulled himself up from the desk, his legs trembling as he staggered toward the ascending stone steps, leaving behind his shotgun, his flashlight, and the silver tape recorder still playing its endless loop of grinding stones in the dark. The air inside the granite chimney was no longer cold. It was dry, dense, and motionless, carrying the faint, metallic scent of heated zinc and burnt paper dust. Sam climbed the stone steps slowly, his boots striking the wet slate with a flat, muffled tread that produced no echo in the vertical shaft. Every 3 paces, the iron band wrapped around his torso constricted slightly, a silent, unseen weight that pulled his center of gravity downward toward the subterranean vault he had left behind. His torch had long since died, its brass housing reduced to a cold, useless cylinder in his pocket. Yet he did not stumble in the pitch blackness of the ascent. The walls of the fissure were lined with a faint, bioluminescent vein of gray mineral, a soft, chalky luminescence that outlined the irregular steps carving their way through the core of the mountain ridge. As someone who has spent years documenting missing persons reports across the Appalachian Basin, I can tell you there is a distinct pattern to how these cases conclude. The physical search party usually finds a discarded boot, an unlatched pocket knife, or a rifle leaning against an oak tree. What they never find is the point where the ground stopped agreeing to hold the weight of the man walking upon it. Sam reached the mouth of the fissure. The opening was a narrow, vertical crack between 2 massive boulders of moss-covered slate, hidden deep within a thicket of stunted mountain hemlocks. He squeezed through the gap, his wool coat tearing on the sharp rock edges, and stepped out onto the snow-covered slope of the ridge. The forest was completely still. The storm that had raged 3 days ago had passed, leaving behind a sky of polished, slate-gray cloud cover that diffused the morning light into a uniform, shadowless glare. The temperature was well below freezing, yet as Sam exhaled, no vapor escaped his lips. His breath was gone, absorbed entirely into the dry, mineral air of the mountain. He looked back down the slope toward the shallow depression where his rented cabin sat. The structure was no longer there. In its place sat the rotting, weathered ruins of an 1800s timber camp, a scattered collection of collapsed log walls, rusted iron hoops from barrel staves, and a single, towering chimney stack built from fieldstone that had turned the color of wet lead. The roof beams had fallen inward decades ago, their decayed cedar timber covered in a thick carpet of pale green moss that showed no trace of the recent heavy snow. Sam walked down the incline toward the clearing, his feet moving through the dry crust without leaving a single boot print in the white sheet. He stopped beside the stone chimney stack where his wood stove had stood 3 hours earlier. Lying on a flat stone near the hearth was his silver pocket tape recorder. The small device was completely encased in a thick shell of clear, solid ice, yet the tiny red recording light beneath the frozen surface was glowing with a steady, unbroken crimson hue. Sam did not reach down to pick up the frozen recorder. He stood in the silent clearing, his graying hair matted with sweat that had frozen into stiff, crystalline needles against his forehead. The weight around his chest, the cold, invisible loop of the Gunter's chain, was no longer dragging him backward into the stone vault. It had settled into a flat, perpetual tension, balancing his body precisely between the sunken foundation of the ruined timber camp and the barren ridge above. He reached into his inner coat pocket and pulled out his surveyor's notebook. The leather cover was dry and cracked, the pages stiffened by the deep frost. He flipped to the final blank sheet at the back of the book. The page was no longer empty, written in his sharp, angular cursive, in ink that was fresh, black, and wet to the touch, were the exact geographic boundary coordinates of the Hollow Creek parcel, followed by a brief, final notation. The perimeter is closed. The surveyor remains on site. Sam closed the notebook and slid it back into his pocket. He turned his eyes toward the eastern ridge, where the narrow county service road ended 3 miles away through the dense hemlocks. He knew that if he walked toward that road, his boots would carry him across the snow without sound or effort. He could return to the lowland towns. He could check into a steam-heated hotel room in the valley. He could sit in a diner and order black coffee from a waitress who would never notice that his shadow on the wood paneling was holding a steel pencil. He was free to leave the hollow, but the hollow had already taken the physical measurement of his existence, registering his weight, his name, and his breathing rhythm into the master ledger beneath the slate floor. He was no longer a visitor in the woods. He was an established mark on an unyielding map, a permanent benchmark that the land would use to anchor its borders whenever the winter freeze set in. Now, as I close this file tonight, I'm left staring at the last piece of evidence recovered from the Hollow Creek Survey Office before it was demolished by the State Highway Department in 1978. It's a standard county topographical map, scaled at 24,000 to 1. If you look closely at the section marked Hollow Creek, just past the old logging boundary where the service road ends, there is a small, black triangle drawn in ink that doesn't match the rest of the cartography. It marks a point of elevation that isn't listed in any official state register. And beside that triangle, written in a small, tight hand that belongs to no living clerk, are 4 simple words: do not resurvey. If this file kept you awake tonight, leave a comment below with your thoughts, or share your own encounter. Until next time, pleasant nightmares.